So are buyer agents the new listing agents? That is the topic that we're going to be talking about today during our Marketing Club podcast. Chris, let's dive into this because this is a hot topic right now.
Well, with the mandatory changes, right? So if you're a buyer's agent, you know that you got to have a signed buyer agreement with people, with consumers before you start showing them homes. And so
Sure.
now the skills that are needed to be effective as a buyer's agent, well, they're very similar to the skills you would need as a listing agent. I mean, Gary, you've been a listing agent for almost 30 years here. Now
Right.
that you have to have those more challenging conversations, it's probably the skill sets are much more on the same level, right?
I think they are much more on the same level now. For those of us just joining us, I do want to bring forth a little bit of background information is that historically, as real estate agents get our licenses, we are kind of thrust into working with
Mhm,
buyers. Why? Because working with buyers used to take fewer
mhm,
skills and negotiating tactics and knowledge than working with listings. And so we really cut our teeth on working with buyers, showing them homes, negotiating contracts, etc. Not to say there are no skills because there are absolutely skills in
mhm,
there. However, the transition of being a buyer's agent historically into being a listing agent would typically take
mhm,
years of working, mentoring under somebody, like being an
mhm.
understudy, if you will, under a listing expert agent. Now, I think times have changed. And whereas the skill set to being a buyer's agent used to not be quite as predominant or required at such a high level as listing, they are now equalizing. And so
Yeah.
that's what we're going to talk about here
We're
today.
going to get into what those skills are, for someone who's sitting there. Let's say you're a buyer's agent, you're thinking about maybe I should think about taking on listings, or maybe you do both, but you tend to focus a little bit more on buyers than sellers right now, and you're thinking maybe now is a good time for me to focus on listings. I mean, Redfin did a study not too long ago, and they found that there's been compression on agent fees ever since the settlement was announced. And so
Sure.
it might make sense for us to focus on listings, whether you're a listing agent, whether you're a buyer's agent. That's one way to combat that compression is to focus on working with sellers, right? Because of the value proposition is much more clear to be able to articulate. The outcome is very clear that you're going to produce, right? So I think there's a lot of benefit. Most of it's time, right? Like when you think about it, if you were to weigh the differences between working with buyers and sellers, I guess in the old way, right, prior to the settlement, prior to those changes, um, if you were working with buyers, um, you knew that you were going to be spending time, right? And that you were going to be contributing your time to serve those customers and get the outcomes that you want. Uh,
Well, if I can interject here for a second, Chris, the vast amount of time of getting a buyer into your car, showing them multiple homes, then refining the home search, showing them multiple homes again, then refining the home search,
mm,
and it is so intense that I know as a listing agent, I can only dedicate a certain amount of time to my buyers
mm,
because at any given time, I can't personally, on my own without a team, I can't personally manage more than 10 or 15 buyers at a
mm,
time simply because of the amount of physical time it takes for me to go show homes, tour homes,
mm,
inspect all these things. Listings, Chris, it was not uncommon for me to carry 50
mm,
listings at a time with no problem.
mhm.
Why? Because it takes a whole lot less of my physical time once the listing agreement is signed than working with buyers.
So the trade-off is I need additional skills, right? I need additional skills like working with a seller and marketing that home and
Right.
so on and so forth and getting the outcome. Versus time, right? I'm going to have the time spent. Not to say that there's not skill there, but you do have to have the time of showing homes and working with that customer to find that home that they're looking for. Whereas when you're the listing agent, people are coming to you.
Correct.
Okay. Another benefit of being a listing agent is if you focus geographically, you can create market share over time, right? So, if you think about the reasons to focus on listings is to combat the fee compression. Hey, you're already doing the skills that are necessary, and you can start getting the benefit of time back, building market share. So, let's talk about like what are some of the skills. If you had to contrast the skill sets, right? So what are the skill sets? And let's talk about it in today's environment, not the old way, but the new way now. What are the skills that are needed as a listing agent? And then, like, how does that compare against being a buyer's agent today?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you start at the beginning of the entire process, attracting potential clients to you as a listing agent takes skill.
Mm,
You have to understand what it is that they're looking for. You have to understand the market. You have to have expert knowledge in the marketplace, and you have to convey that
mhm,
as a listing expert agent. So there are a lot of skills necessary just to convey that to your clients. In addition to that, the consultation with a listing versus with a buyer. Historically with a buyer, it has just really been about order taking, about taking as much information as I can about what you're looking to buy, and then I'll go find that.
mhm.
In listing, the consultation is much more defined, much more articulated, and it does require a different skill set. So, those are two things so far. The consultation is definitely different. Market knowledge, very, very different because under market knowledge, I have to know exactly what's happening in that specific sub market when I'm working with a listing. However, when I'm working with buyers, I could be working over the entire county. I could be working over tri-state area.
Mm.
I mean, it totally depends on what you're working on. So there's a lot of differentiation with those two just to start.
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned, it made me think of, is when you're as a listing agent, you have to be promotionally savvy. Whether it's
Yep.
acquiring sellers in the first place, because we know that the number one determining factor that sellers use in choosing their listing agent is the agent's reputation. And reputation is equivalent to trust. But how do I get my name out there? It's through marketing and it's through promotion. Conversely, if I take on a listing, I need to be able to do marketing and promotion to get that home sold, right? And so, like, you need to have this marketing skill also. Whereas, yes, it's helpful to have marketing skill when you're working with buyers in terms of lead generation,
But man, Chris, when you're working with a seller, it is required. It's not helpful. It is
right? It's
required.
it's required to get the outcome that the seller wants. It's also required if you want to have a value proposition that you're going to share with prospective sellers on how you're going to get the results that you do. Well, it's going to come back to the marketing and promotional element.
Yeah.
So marketing is another one. I think
That's a
let me
client.
ask you this, Gary, because I'm going to generalize for a moment here, but just for the sake of expanding on this sales skill concept, right? So in the old way, pre NAR settlement, pre August 17th, a way that I could work with a buyer would be, hey, they want to look at a home, and I could use the process of showing them homes to build trust, right? So that I could get a buyer rep agreement signed.
Correct.
Okay, and,
Right.
and now I have to have that buyer agreement signed. It doesn't have to be a buyer rep agreement, but I have to have a buyer agreement that spells out my compensation and so on and so forth before I
Yeah.
start showing them homes. So the old way of how I might build trust with a client to get a buyer rep agreement signed, I can't do that anymore. I have to be able to articulate that value before I even start showing properties, which is what you have to do as a listing agent, right?
Well, that's exactly right. So what's happening here is historically with working with buyers, my requirement for building trust with a client before they sign a representation agreement with me was greatly expanded in a length of time. That
Mm,
horizon of time was greatly long, like much longer than working with a seller. To your point, I could go out and we could tour homes for
mm,
years if necessary before I needed to get that buyer rep agreement signed before we submit an offer, right? So that horizon of time really started from the moment that we had that initial consultation all the way up until we started writing an offer.
mhm,
That used to be the original horizon of time. Now it's greatly compressed. It's compressed so much that now it is equating to the horizon of time that I have as a listing expert agent in order to get a listing agreement
mm,
signed. So, in order to compress that time, well, we have to have different processes in place to build
mm,
trust at an amplified velocity in order to get them to a place to trust us enough to sign a representation
mm,
agreement. Now, if you're a listing agent already and have been for years, well, you already know there's a compressed process there to make that happen. We now have to do
Mm.
that, and we have to acquire those skills and the knowledge and the process and the tools and the techniques right now as buyer's agents to compress that. And that's going to be critical.
So the key step there, when you as a listing agent, and this is why we say, or ask the are buyers agents the new listing agent? Because as a listing agent, you have to convince the seller to work with you before you list that home on the MLS, which means you got to articulate your value. You got to give them concrete reasons to hire you to be
Right.
able to market that home and put it in the MLS. Well, again, you got to get the agreement signed. And now, as a buyer's agent, you also have to get an agreement signed just to go show homes. So that means, in the same manner, you have to articulate value. You have to give that person concrete reasons because they see what you're going to get paid, and you have to be able to justify what that's going to be. And you be have to,
But it's
but
compressed,
it's all
right? It's
compressed
compressed.
in this little short window. Now, fact is, once you get that agreement signed, you are now on the stage of performance to be able to do a really good job for that customer. So you're always still on the hook. It's the same way when as a listing agent, where if you're, let's say it takes a few months to sell the home, like you need to keep that seller updated on what's going on. You just can't disappear. There's our skills and communication that are required so that that seller understands that this is normal. It's taking the appropriate amount of time, right?
Sure.
And so all of those communications are so that you can get to the outcome and you can collect your fee in working with that seller. Same thing, when you're working with a buyer. Yeah, now you need to have the compressed time frame to be able to articulate your value, give them concrete reasons to hire you, sign the agreement. But then even after that agreement is signed, you have to perform at a really high level and make sure they understand what it is that you're doing as you do it, so that when it's time, that your fees are justified. I was thinking of how a lot of times people will shield their customers from the hassles and problems that exist, which I think is good, but they still need to know what you were doing on their behalf. Because if you shield them from the problems, they don't understand the value of what you brought to the table.
Correct.
So, but you're doing it out of service, right? It's like, oh, I'm taking care of my client. Well, take care of it, but still educate them and inform them on what's been going on so that they can give you the recognition that you deserve. And ultimately, they will attribute that to the value that you've brought to the table. Let me ask you this. What about, is there any difference, like as a listing agent versus, buyer's agent, in the post-sale follow-up and communication and stuff like that? Are there any differences that take place, or is that still pretty much the same?
Well, so I think it's going to depend on each individual agent and the preference that they're using in order to stay in touch with their clients. So, historically, I'll just share what I've done is in working with buyers, is that upon closing, I would always offer to host a welcome party for them,
Mm,
like a housewarming
nice.
party for all of their friends. And I would send out the marketing and we'd host it. And so that was something that I always used to do. In addition to that, like longer term, I would also add their home anniversary, their
Mm,
home purchase anniversary to my database. And I would get, I'd get pinged by my CRM tool in order to stay in touch with these folks post sale, because it was always important for me to remind them that I was there
mm,
with them when they moved in. I was there with them to make this happen, and I'm still here for you.
mm.
And so to bring up, hey, can you believe it, Chris? Congratulations. You guys have been in your house for 3 years now. I'm so happy for you guys. If there's anything I can ever do for you or any of your friends or family members, please let me know. So, it's always staying in touch, but also in post follow up with buyers, I would always stay in touch with them to make sure that they had an updated market analysis of their home so they understand how much equity they have in their house so that they might be able to make a move in the future. That's on the buy side. Now, post sale follow up on the sales side, it's really important to understand where your clients are moving
Mm.
to and staying in touch with them about their move, about how things are going, especially if they relocate, because that's another thing, is making sure that we get them connected with a real estate professional wherever they're going, but then changing up the marketing and the follow up in order to take care of them wherever they are. So those are some small differences there
Let me ask you this.
around the post market follow up.
You know how, as a listing agent, we have, like we might market a property as having gone under contract or recently sold. Do you ever see a version of that in working with buyers? Do you see a benefit in doing that if you're a buyer's agent
I
working with?
absolutely. So this is a great thing. Is that I always that's another thing. Yes, thank you for
Mm,
saying that, because what we were just talking about is how do we stay in touch with people, with our clients after the sale, but how do we market
Mm,
ourselves after a successful sale? Now, on the buy side, I would always do a story tell,
mhm,
and I would say, hey, Chris and his family had this challenge. They wanted this. I came in and flew in and I produced this result for
mm.
them. If you're looking for a similar result, make sure that you contact me. So that's storytelling, success storytelling. People love to hear stories about other people who have similar challenges that they have right then, and because it just builds trust. Now, after selling a home, successfully selling a home, it's always important to make sure that your database of past clients and potential clients know about the success that you created upon
Mm.
listing and selling that home. But boy, isn't it important to use that same knowledge to market yourself to the geographic region and other similar type sellers that may
Mm.
be looking to make a move. So there's a different skill set there in marketing yourself and marketing the success that you were able to procure for your clients in order to generate additional business for your
I
pipeline.
think that's going to be, even if you decide that you're going to continue to be a buyer's agent or you're not going to focus on listings, that's a good strategy to potentially pick up from listing agents, is doing that post transaction marketing. Because the reason why we do it, why it's so effective, is this: number, according to the National Association of Realtors, the number one determining factor that sellers use in choosing their listing agent is the agent's reputation. Now, that comes from the profile of buyers and sellers from NAR. Interestingly enough, the number one determining factor for buyers is trust. Now, I guess you could make the argument that reputation and trust are kind of the same thing. Although reputation is like what others say about you, versus trust is the impression that I have about you. And so, with the changes taking place, I could see a situation where buyers may look more towards people's reputation, and not just whether I trust you or not. And why is that? Well, because there's some more tougher conversations that have to happen now that maybe didn't have to happen before. So now I need to rely on my interpretation of, well, how well have you worked with others? How well has the satisfaction that you have produced for other people? Because I need to trust in that if I'm going to hire you, right? And so, in order to make
Right.
that, in order to build a reputation, you want to tell those stories, those post transaction success stories, whether that's, hey, recently sold, right? Or recently purchased might be a thing that we start doing. And so those are all like a good example of contrasting some of the skills and how they are more similar now, post August 17th, NAR settlement rule changes and stuff. It is more equivalent now in the skills that you have. And there's a lot of benefit to being a listing agent, right? You've kind of crafted your career around being a listing agent for the last 27, 28 years. Doesn't mean you've excluded buyers, right? Because oftentimes, buyers are disguised as sellers, and conversely, sellers are disguised as buyers. So, but if your focus has been there, it gave you the time so that you could generate both and build a surplus.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us in today's Marketing Club podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard today, make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and Chris and I will both see you on our next episode.